So to end the show today, we're going to be giving out some more free agency grades for the 2021 NFL offseason. I've had a blast doing these. I think it's really fun to do. It's fun to kind of put into perspective all the moves that everybody made during the offseason. And normally we do this at the front of the show because it's easy. It's a good way to lead into the show. But I really wanted to talk about the Sam Darnold trade at the top of the show, and we did. So now we're shoving this to the back of the show. And today we're going to be covering the NFC South. This should be a much shorter segment, especially compared to the rest. I'm going to try and place all of these in a playlist at some point to make them easily watchable, because the thumbnails can be similar at times. It can be hard to differentiate between the certain divisions, the certain videos. So I'm going to try and put them all in a video to make them easier to watch. And those will be on YouTube for those of you who are listening to the podcast version of this. So I'm going to be doing that at some point. Today we're going to be talking about the NFC South, which, as I said, is going to be a little bit shorter, considering that two out of the four teams, were in salary cap hell, and the other team basically did nothing but retain every single player on their roster. So it's going to be much shorter today. Let's just go ahead and get into it. Let's start with the Buccaneers, who were that team that retained everybody on the roster. The Buccaneers get an A for their 2021 NFL free agency. Look, the Buccaneers are one of the first teams in the Super Bowl era, if not the first team in the Super Bowl era, to retain every single starter on both offense and defense after a Super Bowl victory. Everybody came back, and some of them even took pay cuts, which is insane. Brady signed a new contract, took a little bit of a pay cut. Levante David signed a new contract, as did Gronkowski. 1 year, $8 million contract for Gronkowski, as did Shaq Barrett. Chris Godwin was franchise tagged. So although he's probably not too happy about being franchise tagged, he did have a bit of a down year. Maybe that was because of how many wide receivers the Buccaneers brought in during the season. But regardless of that, he's being tagged. He will come back for another season, and I don't necessarily know if he minds if he keeps winning championships, but Leonard Fournette was brought back as well. The Buccaneers signed and brought back every single starter. That is extremely difficult in this day and age in the NFL, where it's difficult to keep a roster together, especially when people are due for a big payday, like a bunch of the Buccaneers defense was due for a big payday. The Buccaneers get an A for keeping everybody. They did a fantastic job, and maybe it's just because the time to win now in Tampa Bay is now. And they're looking for more championships. Everybody's all in Tampa Bay. Moving on to the Falcons. The Falcons get a C. The Falcons really didn't make any moves in free agency this offseason, so it's hard to grade them. But what they were able to do is wiggle out of one of the worst salary cap situations in the NFL, only to be trumped by another team in the NFC South. They were able to renegotiate contracts for most of the players that were eating into the salary cap. I think their top five account for 67% of the salary cap for the Falcons. That's Julio Jones, Matt Ryan, Grady Jarrett, Dante Fowler Jr., and another name that I'm forgetting. That's 4 out of the 5. Regardless, they were able to renegotiate some of those contracts, and they were able to wiggle out of the salary cap hell that they were in. They did sign a defensive tackle from New England. I think it was Brandon Copeland, but other than that, they really didn't make any moves in free agency. They couldn't. They were, strangleholded by the salary cap. The Falcons get a C. It's hard to grade them, so I guess you give them the average grade. I think I should and I will give them points for being able to scramble out of a salary cap hell situation without dropping a whole bunch of their players. Moving on to the Panthers. The Panthers get a B-. The Panthers are a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, we've already talked about Sam Darnold today at the top of the show. Trading for Sam Darnold, which I already find to be a bit of a questionable move, will probably boost the Panthers' free agency grade. But as pertains to the actual free agency signings, the Panthers were a bit of a mixed bag there. The Panthers spent the first day of the free agency period signing Jets guard Pat Eiflin, who is a pretty subpar offensive lineman, to be truthful with you, and then signing Cam Irving for a 2-year deal, who has been another average offensive lineman, who is also coming off an injury. Then the Panthers lost Curtis Samuel to Washington, probably their biggest wide receiver apart from Robbie Anderson. So the first few days were not too good for Carolina, but they rebounded with some strong sightings. Rashad Perryman from Los Angeles, the Chargers, Hassan Reddick from Arizona. So they really shored up their linebacker core. So I don't know if they are going to take a linebacker in the draft. I thought they would before they signed those guys. So you have Brian Burns, who had a near Pro Bowl season. Then you have Hassan Reddick coming back. Rashard Perriman is a decent linebacker as well, so they might be set in that regard. They also signed David Moore, wide receiver from Seattle, to replace Curtis Samuel. David Moore is a fine signing. He's not going to be the level that Curtis Samuel was, but he is still going to be a nice weapon for Bridgewater or Darnold, whoever that quarterback is going to be. I don't really like the offensive line signings. I think they paid way too much money for offensive linemen who really don't deserve it. Obviously, the offensive lineman market was kind of wishy-washy this year, but regardless of that, the rest of the signings by the Panthers were pretty decent. The Panthers get a B-. And last but not least, the New Orleans Saints. The New Orleans Saints get a C-. Kind of like the Falcons, the Saints were bottlenecked by their deficit in the salary cap. It ranged anywhere from $82 million in debt to over $100 million, depending on who you ask. But they did more than the Falcons in terms of re-signing key players, and a lot of that is thanks to the voidable years kind of workaround that you do with the salary cap. The Saints franchise tag Marcus Williams, who is one of the best safeties in the NFL, so although he's expensive, ultimately it's going to be a good decision to keep him. The Saints also re-signed Jameis Winston, which, if he proves to be an improved quarterback, could be a steal, considering that they basically pulled the whole bunch of voidable years BS and brought Taysom Hill back for dirt cheap. So, if Jameis Winston turns into a great quarterback out of this, he could be the steal of the offseason this season. They did lose a lot of people this offseason, however, especially along the defensive line. Trey Hendrickson, Malcolm Jenkins, to name a couple. The Saints will have to draft well. They will absolutely have to draft well to shore up the depth at the linebacker, tight end. Nice voice crack. Tight end and defensive lineman position. They have no depth there. Pretty much everybody left. The Saints did retain their best defensive player, as I said, in Marcus Williams, apart from Cameron Jordan, and locked in the most important position in football with a player that, if he proves to work out, will be one of the biggest free agency steals this offseason in Jameis Winston. The Saints get a C-. And that is the recap for the NFC South. Again, very, very short, and that's because a lot of the teams in the NFC South didn't really do too much. I think the Panthers did the most out of any of those teams. So those are the grades for the NFC South. We will be doing the NFC West next, and we will be finishing with the NFC North whenever we get to that. So we're almost through the NFL free agency grades, and then we can start talking about mock drafts, start talking about the draft a little bit more in detail. I've started doing more isolated segments for the draft. Obviously, we talked about the 49ers, the Falcons. We talked about kind of Denver and Carolina today. So we'll continue to kind of do separate segments for those teams, but that's the end of the show today. Thank you all so much. Hey folks, thank you so much for listening to this segment from the Hard-Headed Sports Podcast. If you enjoyed this segment, make sure that you drop a like on the video and a comment. It helps me out a bunch, and if you're interested in watching more segments like this from the show after the show has been completed, you should definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you're interested in listening to the entire show in its full-length entirety, you should listen to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Anchor. Once again, thank you so much for watching the video. My name is Nick Ryan, and I will see you all again very soon.